in the heart of a bustling African village, where the air often carried the scent of roasted maize and the sound of traders bargaining filled the narrow pathways, there lived a young woman whose presence seemed almost too gentle for the harshness of her surroundings. She was not born into wealth nor adorned with silks and ornaments that would make heads turn in the market, yet there was a quiet dignity in her every step, and an unshakable kindness that made her more radiant than gold. Her life was simple, woven with daily tasks of fetching water from the river, pounding grain with steady rhythm, and tending to the small goats that grazed near the edge of the village. Unlike others who boasted loudly of their possessions or sought recognition in every act, she worked silently, her hands always busy, her lips always soft with words of encouragement for those around her. The children ran to her for comfort when their games ended in tears, and even the elderly found warmth in her respectful greetings. Her honesty was spoken of often. In a place where bargains could turn sour and people sometimes sharpened their tongues more than their tools, she remained unshaken in her truth. If someone gave her more than what was fair, she returned it without hesitation. If someone wronged her, she held no bitterness in her heart. Such a nature should have earned her nothing but love, yet within her own family, or among those who should have been closest to her, envy began to grow like thorns among roses. The very brightness of her soul seemed to cast shadows upon those who desired recognition without effort, wealth without labor, and admiration without kindness. To them, her gentleness was not a virtue but a constant reminder of what they lacked, and rather than seeking to better themselves, they chose to despise her. It was not that she flaunted her character or paraded her goodness before others. She was humble to the point of silence, never raising her voice above necessity, never asking for more than what her hands could earn. Yet in every corner of the village people noticed. A merchant might say, "That girl would never cheat you of a single grain," while a mother whispered to her child, "Learn from her patience and you will walk a safe path." Words like these, carried by wind and repeated by many, made the envious ones boil inside. Why should she, who had nothing of value, who wore the same faded dress day after day, who ate only when work was done, why should she be admired more than those who strutted with beads and gold? Their jealousy was like fire hidden under dry grass, waiting for the right spark to leap into flame. The girl, however, remained unaware of the storm brewing around her. Her days were filled with duties that kept her grounded. At dawn, she rose before the first rooster crowed, her hands washing quickly in the cold water fetched the night before. The grinding stone would echo through the air as she prepared meal for her family, though rarely did she get to taste the best of it. Her portion was always the smallest, often handed to her with reluctant eyes that carried more scorn than gratitude. Still, she accepted it without complaint, bowing her head with quiet dignity. She walked to the market not to linger and gossip, but to sell a little produce, carrying herself with humility even when others mocked her plainness. If laughter rose behind her back, she did not turn, and if whispers cut at her name, she pressed them deep into silence, never allowing bitterness to take root. But kindness, though soft, often unsettles the cruel. There were those in her family, perhaps a stepmother, perhaps cousins, who could not endure how the villagers praised her gentleness. Their eyes followed her with disdain, searching for flaws where none could be found. They twisted her honesty into weakness, her humility into foolishness. They whispered that she was nothing but a lowly girl destined to serve and fade into shadows. Yet, their whispers only made her light brighter in the eyes of those who knew her heart. The elders often said, "Her tears water the soil, even sorrow becomes a blessing in her hands." Such sayings only deepened the envy that poisoned those who should have loved her most. Still, in her innocence she never raised her heart against them. She believed, perhaps too deeply, that goodness would always be seen, that honesty would always win favor, and that family, no matter how cold, would one day understand the truth of her heart. She did not see how her very goodness set her apart, making her a target for cruelty. The seeds of envy had already been sown, and though she moved with grace through her daily life, the ground beneath her feet was being prepared for betrayal. She was a young woman whose kindness was both her shield and her burden, for it brought her the love of strangers and the hatred of those too close to harm her. Thus, in the rhythm of village life, the girl stood as a figure of quiet strength, honest, gentle, humble, but surrounded by eyes that glared with envy. Her story had only begun, but already the contrast of love and cruelty was being drawn around her like a circle. She was the girl who gave freely and asked for nothing, yet it was this very light that would lead her into darkness, where her tears would be mocked, her name dragged, and her heart tested beyond measure. Their jealousy began like a whisper in the wind, faint but persistent, a rustling that refused to be silenced. At first, it was her stepmother's tongue, sharp and quick, muttering under her breath when the girl returned from the market with warm greetings from the merchants. "She pretends to be humble," the stepmother hissed to her own daughters. "But humility is just another mask for pride." These words were repeated in hushed tones to neighbors, to travelers, to anyone willing to lend an ear to malice. The girl, oblivious at first, continued her work with steady hands and a pure heart, but the shadows of envy had already begun to spread. The stepmother and her daughters could not bear the way people smiled at the girl. Farmers gave her the freshest vegetables for a modest price. Women praised her for always offering to help at the well, carrying water not only for herself but for those who struggled. Old men sitting beneath the shade trees called her Child of Grace, for she spoke to them with respect, never hurrying away as though their words meant nothing. Every simple act of kindness made her shine brighter in the eyes of others, and with every bit of praise she received, the bitterness of her family deepened. Rumors grew twisted like vines choking a tree. "Have you noticed," one of the stepsisters whispered in the ear of a gossiping neighbor, "how she always arrives just when someone is in need? Perhaps she causes the trouble herself, only to appear as if she is the savior." Another chimed in, "Do not be fooled by her silence. A quiet tongue often hides a scheming heart." These lies crept through the village like smoke, filling the air with suspicion. Yet the girl never defended herself. She believed truth would shine brighter than falsehood, that her actions spoke louder than words. But envy is not easily satisfied. When the villagers praised her for her skill in weaving, calling her cloth fine and durable, her stepmother scoffed loudly in the market. "Anyone can weave well when the spirits favor her. Do not think it is her skill, it is simply luck. The spirits give gifts unevenly and she hoards them." When she was praised for her generosity, another rumor spread that she gave only because she wanted something in return. "Wait and see," her stepmother said with a cold smile. "The day will come when her kindness is revealed as cunning." The cruelest part was that the villagers began to wonder. Though many still trusted her, a seed of doubt was planted. Some avoided her eyes, uncertain whether to believe the goodness they had seen or the venom whispered into their ears. The girl, though pained, did not falter. She carried her basket to the well as always, spoke kindly to those she met, and lifted burdens when she could. Her silence in the face of lies made her appear even nobler to some, but it made her family all the more furious. Every word of praise was like a spark that lit the dry tinder of their resentment. The stepmother, watching from the shadows, clenched her jaw as she heard the village children laugh and run to the girl, clinging to her skirts as though she were their elder sister. The stepsisters watched merchants slip her extra grain or fruit, muttering curses under their breath. They wanted her humbled, silenced, reduced to nothing. And so, their jealousy, once only whispered, grew sharp and loud, preparing itself for cruelty that would not stop at rumors but turn into open humiliation. The girl did not yet know it, but the whispers had already sown the storm that would soon break upon her. The day the storm of lies broke over her head was as ordinary as any other. She had risen before dawn as she always did, to fetch water from the river and tend to the little goats in the pen. Her neighbors had greeted her kindly, some offering warm smiles and others soft words of thanks for the help she had given them in past days. She was, after all, the one who sat with sick children when mothers needed rest, the one who shared her own food when a neighbor's harvest had been thin. But behind her back, the poison of envy had been growing sharper, and that morning it was ready to pierce her heart. Her stepmother had long searched for a way to soil her name. It was not enough that she toiled day and night in their house, not enough that she obeyed without question. The stepmother could not endure the way others admired her gentleness. "People should speak of me, not of her," she hissed to her own daughters. And so, when a small bundle of coins belonging to a visiting merchant went missing, the stepmother whispered her scheme into motion. "She has taken it," the woman declared, loud enough for neighbors to hear. "She, with her soft eyes and quiet tongue, she hides her sins beneath her silence." The merchant, though uncertain, was swayed by the woman's certainty. And her daughters, eager to echo their mother, nodded furiously. Within moments the rumor had spread from hut to hut, carried by wagging tongues and gleeful whispers. By midday the square in the center of the village was filled with people. The men had left their stalls of grain and cloth, the women had paused their weaving and pounding of millet. Children clung to their mothers' sides, wide-eyed at the tension that swirled like dust in the air. The accused girl was dragged forward by her stepmother's hand, her wrist clamped in a grip of iron. "Behold her," the woman cried. "The thief who dares steal from a guest under our roof." The girl stumbled as they pushed her into the open circle. Her face was pale, but her eyes, clear and trembling, met the stares of her neighbors. "I have taken nothing," she whispered, her voice thin against the roar of the crowd. "I swear by the spirits of my ancestors, I have never touched what was not mine." But the stepmother's voice drowned her. "Lies. She has always been deceitful, hiding behind her sweet face. Look into her hands, look beneath her mat, you will find the merchant's coins." And so they did. A small pouch, carefully planted the night before, was pulled from beneath her sleeping mat. Gasps of outrage swept through the onlookers. Though a few frowned in doubt, the sight of the coins silenced most of their hesitation. The merchant himself, torn between gratitude and anger, said nothing, his eyes darting between the accuser and the accused. The girl's heart thundered. She knew the trap had been set for her, but who would believe her now? The pouch seemed undeniable, a cruel mirror that reflected not her truth but her enemy's malice. The crowd murmured in low voices, "So gentle and yet a thief? We were fooled by her smile. Perhaps kindness is only a mask." Her tears came unbidden, hot and heavy, sliding down her cheeks as she raised her hands in protest. "Please," she pleaded. "You know me. I have never wronged a soul among you. This is not my doing." But the weight of the stepmother's cunning words pressed down like chains. The people were ready for a spectacle, and the girl's cries only added to the bitter flavor of their suspicion. By the time the sun tilted westward, her name, once spoken with admiration, was coated with doubt. The shame her stepmother had wished upon her seemed complete. The girl stood in the heart of her own village, her honesty mocked, her gentleness questioned, her good deeds forgotten. What had taken years to build, her reputation, her trust, was shattered in a single hour of false accusation. But even as the crowd turned from her with whispered judgments, something lingered in the air, a hesitation, a seed of unease. Not everyone was convinced. A handful of merchants glanced at one another with furrowed brows. An elder scratched his chin, troubled by the stepmother's triumphant smile. Though the girl's enemies rejoiced in their success, they had unknowingly sown the very doubt that would later rise to strike them down. They gripped her wrists tightly, their nails biting into her skin as though they wanted her pain to be visible even before her public humiliation began. She stumbled as they yanked her forward, the dust of the village roads rising to cling to her hair and dress. Children paused from their games, men dropped their tools, and women looked up from their grinding stones as the sound of jeering voices spread like wildfire. "Thief! Liar! Deceiver!" they shouted, pulling her toward the heart of the village where the market bustled. The marketplace was alive with colors of fruits, woven baskets, and jars of spices, yet all brightness seemed to dim as they dragged her through its center. The people stopped to stare, curiosity hardening into judgment. Her cries of pain were swallowed by laughter, her pleas for understanding smothered beneath the cruel chanting of her accusers. Her feet caught on the uneven stones and she fell to her knees, the crowd roaring with cruel amusement as though her stumble was proof of her guilt. They forced her up again, shoving her so that she lurched forward, her tears leaving streaks down her dust-stained face. She raised her trembling hands in a desperate attempt to defend herself, crying out, "I have done nothing. I swear it. By the gods, I am innocent." But her words met only silence and whispers. No one dared to move for her, no one dared to step between her and her tormentors. The villagers glanced at each other uneasily, but fear of the family's power and influence chained their tongues. Her stepmother walked behind her with a triumphant smile, clutching a broken piece of cloth that was said to be the proof of her crime. The crowd murmured as the false evidence was raised high. "See what she has done," the stepmother cried, her voice sharp like a whip. "She steals, she deceives, and she thinks her innocent face will protect her." The people shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes in shame because they had once praised the girl's gentleness, others biting back doubt because to question now was dangerous. The marketplace that had once welcomed her with warmth, where merchants had smiled as she bought grain with honesty, now turned into a stage of humiliation. She could hear laughter, loud and cruel, echoing in her ears. Some pointed at her with mockery, others whispered, "So even she, the gentle one, has darkness in her heart." Her tears fell harder, not only for the injustice but for the betrayal of silence from those who knew her true nature. She searched the crowd desperately, hoping for even one voice to rise and defend her, but none came. Instead, the merchants who once handed her an extra measure of millet when she had too little now stood behind their stalls, their lips pressed tight, their eyes averted. Her body trembled as they forced her to the center of the square. She could barely stand, her knees weak beneath the weight of shame. The cries of "thief" and "shameless" cut deeper than any blade. Her sobs grew uncontrollable and she wept openly before them all. Her tears dropped onto the earth, and though the crowd mocked them, each tear carried a truth none of them could yet see. Her innocence was clear in her eyes, in her trembling voice, but it was buried beneath the venom of those who hated her. And so, in that moment, she stood in the middle of the marketplace, alone, broken, and yet quietly defiant in the purity of her heart, even as the world mocked her sorrow. Her cries fell heavy upon the air, each sob carrying not just her pain but the weight of injustice pressing down on her fragile frame. Yet instead of softening the hearts around her, her tears became fuel for their cruelty. The relatives who had plotted against her sneered openly, their laughter sharp like blades cutting into her spirit. "Look at her," one spat, pointing so that the gathered crowd could see. "A thief pretending to be innocent. She weeps because she knows her lies have been uncovered." Another chimed in mockingly, "She is cursed. No good ever follows her shadow. That's why she hides behind fake kindness." Their words, meant to strip her of dignity, echoed through the market square where she stood trembling under the weight of so many eyes. The villagers who had once nodded in greeting when she passed now stood back, their silence adding another layer of cruelty. Some looked away, ashamed to meet her eyes, while others, out of fear or the thrill of gossip, smirked as if her tears were a performance staged for their entertainment. Children, mimicking the scorn of their elders, pointed fingers and giggled, repeating the names they heard the adults whisper. Every moment became an unending torment, each laugh another stone hurled at her wounded soul. She tried to explain, to let the truth tumble from her lips, but her words were drowned beneath the rising tide of jeers and mocking chants. Her stepmother leaned closer, her voice a poisonous whisper made loud enough for others to hear. "See how quickly she breaks? What kind of girl weeps so easily unless her heart is guilty?" With every accusation, the crowd grew more certain of the lie, more blind to the truth that shone in her desperate eyes. She clasped her hands together, pleading for someone, anyone, to listen, but the only response was mocking laughter that swelled until it seemed the whole marketplace roared against her. The humiliation was not just in the words spoken but in the deliberate cruelty of the spectacle. They made her stand where merchants bartered, where women bargained for food, where men haggled over tools and cloth. It was a place of life and community, yet in that moment it became an arena of judgment where she was displayed like an animal, stripped of dignity and left vulnerable before those who should have protected her. Her tears streamed freely, and with each drop that fell onto the dust at her feet, her tormentors found another reason to mock her. "See how weak she is," they shouted. "She cannot even face the truth of her shame." Yet beneath their cruelty lay something they did not see, a strength slowly rising in the very heart they sought to shatter. For though she wept, though her body trembled under the weight of scorn, her spirit refused to bow entirely. Her tears were not weakness but honesty, not curse but purity. And as the crowd reveled in her humiliation, a subtle shift began almost unnoticed. A few eyes softened, a few hearts stirred uneasily, for even laughter could not completely drown the whisper of truth that clung to her every plea. The marketplace, once alive with the usual sounds of bargaining and laughter, had fallen into a strange, tense quiet. The girl stood in the center, her head bowed, her face streaked with tears, while the voices of her accusers rang sharp and unrelenting. Around her, a crowd had gathered, merchants with goods half unpacked, children clutching at their mothers' arms, and elders leaning on their walking sticks, their wrinkled brows furrowing as they watched. None of them spoke. None of them moved. They stood like statues, their silence carrying more weight than words could have. The merchants were the first to arrive, drawn in by the commotion. They had been spreading colorful fabrics, stacking gourds, and weighing baskets of grain when the girl's cries broke through the air. At first they thought it was a quarrel like any other, a squabble over prices or a dispute over land. But when they saw the girl being dragged, her delicate wrists bruised from the rough grip of those who claimed her guilt, they fell still. Some merchants exchanged uneasy glances, their hands hovering above their goods, suddenly disinterested in trade. They had heard whispers about her before, whispers of her kindness, her honesty, the quiet way she helped others without expecting anything in return. And now, those same whispers were being twisted into accusations. One merchant, an older man with weary eyes, shifted on his feet as though he wanted to speak, but the sharp glares of the girl's accusers silenced him. He looked away ashamed. The elders, too, had gathered, their presence lending the moment an air of judgment. Their white beards and slow movements carried the weight of tradition and authority, and the crowd often looked to them in times of conflict. Yet now they stood mute, their staffs tapping the earth softly as they leaned closer to see. Their eyes darted from the girl's trembling form to the jeering faces around her, and though unease flickered across their faces, no words of wisdom came. Some clenched their jaws tightly, others looked down at the ground as though the dust might hide them from the guilt of their silence. They had lived long enough to know when something was unjust, but they also knew the cost of speaking against those with influence. It was easier, perhaps, to let things play out and pretend it was not their place to interfere. Still, the weight of their silence pressed down on the gathering, heavier than any spoken condemnation could have been. The children, wide-eyed and innocent, clung to the hems of their mother's garments. They did not understand the full meaning of the accusations, but they felt the cruelty in the laughter that rang through the marketplace. Some of them had played with the girl before, chasing goats in the fields or sharing roasted maize under the trees. To them, she was gentle and kind, someone who never raised her voice and always smiled softly. Now, seeing her weep while others mocked her, their small hearts stirred with confusion. They tugged at their mother's hands, whispering questions. Why are they hurting her? Why does no one stop them? The mothers hushed them quickly, fearful of drawing attention, but the children's innocent eyes reflected the unease spreading like a quiet fire. As the girls stood humiliated, the silence of the observers grew louder. It was the kind of silence that made people shift uncomfortably, the kind that revealed the cowardice of those who could have spoken but chose not to. A woman at the edge of the crowd bit her lip, her hands trembling as she adjusted her basket of cassava. A young man clenched his fists at his sides but kept them hidden in the folds of his cloak. Each person who watched felt the sting of guilt, the sense that what they were seeing was wrong. And yet, fear held their tongues still. It was not just the fear of the girls' accusers that kept them silent, it was the fear of being isolated. In a village where everyone's life was intertwined, standing against the loudest voices meant inviting trouble to one's own doorstep. So they remained as shadows, silent witnesses to cruelty, pretending neutrality while knowing in their hearts that their silence made them complicit. The marketplace air grew heavier with every moment, as if the very earth beneath them recoiled from the injustice. The goats tethered nearby bleated nervously, and a hawk circled above, its shadow gliding across the scene as though marking the guilt of those below. Even nature seemed to pause as though it too was bearing witness. And though no words were spoken, a silent truth was dawning in the hearts of the observers. What they were allowing to unfold was not just the humiliation of one girl, but the staining of the entire village's conscience. Each pair of eyes that watched and did nothing became a mirror reflecting cowardice, and deep within, unease began to take root. They did not yet know it, but this silence would not protect them forever. It would follow them, whisper in their dreams and return to them in ways they could not yet imagine. At first, the jeering voices of the girls' tormentors drowned out everything in the marketplace. Their words stung sharper than stones, each insult meant to crush her spirit before the crowd. Yet, as the humiliation dragged on, something began to shift, subtle, almost invisible at first, but undeniable to those who felt it stir within themselves. Among the rows of merchants who had come to sell their wares, whispers began to ripple. A cloth seller who had known the girl since childhood, leaned toward his neighbor. "This is too much," he murmured under his breath, his eyes fixed on the trembling figure in the dust. "She is not the kind to steal or deceive. Everyone knows this." His neighbor, a potter with cracked hands from long days of work, nodded but said nothing aloud for fear of the stepmother's wrath. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted. Not every face in the marketplace was twisted with laughter. Some looked away, unable to meet the girl's tearful eyes. A young mother, holding her child close, lowered her head in shame. She remembered the times the girl had carried water for her when she was ill, or shared food without expecting anything in return. Yet now she stood silent, her lips pressed tight as guilt settled heavy in her chest. Even the children, who at first echoed the laughter of their elders, grew quiet. The longer they watched, the less amusing the scene became. Their young eyes, unclouded by jealousy or pride, sensed something cruel in the way the stepmother's voice cracked like a whip, in the way the girl's knees bled from the rough ground. Some shifted uncomfortably, tugging at their mother's clothes, asking in hushed voices why no one was helping. The elders of the village, seated beneath the shade of the great tree, exchanged uneasy glances. Their authority commanded respect, yet in this moment they hesitated. To speak in defense of the girl meant standing against the family who now hurled accusations with such venom. Still, doubt crept into their silence. One elder stroked his gray beard slowly, his gaze fixed not on the girl's tears but on the unnatural delight of her accusers. Something about the scene felt wrong, as if the harmony of the village itself was cracking under the weight of cruelty. Among the traders passing through the village, men who had no ties to the girl or her family, unease was even clearer. They watched with detached eyes, but their brows furrowed, their lips pressed thin. One of them muttered, "This is not justice. This is envy dressed as truth." His companions nodded grimly, though none dared raise their voices above a whisper. It was in these small gestures, the averted gazes, the whispers of doubt, the tightening of jaws, that the first cracks appeared in the wall of mockery. Though the laughter continued loudly, it no longer rang with the same power. Beneath it, another current stirred, low but growing, the stirring of shame, of conscience, of quiet recognition that something here was deeply wrong. The girl, though broken with tears, seemed to sense it too. Her gaze swept across the crowd, searching among the countless faces. And in those lowered eyes and hushed whispers, there was a flicker of hope, fragile, trembling but alive. The laughter that had echoed so confidently through the crowded marketplace began to falter like a drum losing rhythm. The girl's stepmother and relatives had jeered with venom on their tongues, spitting accusations like arrows, but now, a different sound stirred among the stalls. It was not laughter, it was murmuring, low and uneasy like wind gathering before a storm. The merchants, who had been watching from their wooden stalls and shaded awnings, exchanged glances. Their eyes, once drawn to the spectacle for amusement, now lingered on the girl's trembling form, her cheeks wet with tears that glistened beneath the sun. One elder, a man known in the marketplace for his fairness and silver beard, stepped forward. His sandals scraped against the dusty ground as silence deepened around him. He raised a hand, his voice sharp enough to slice through the lingering chuckles. "Enough," he said. His words rang out, startling even the crows perched on the rooftops. The stepmother sneered, ready to mock him too, but the old man's eyes burned with a fire that quieted her tongue. He looked at the girl, his voice softening. "I have seen many tears in my years," he said, "tears of liars, tears of thieves, and tears of those who hope to wash away their guilt. But hers," he paused, his hand pointing toward the young woman, her head bowed in shame. "Her tears are pure. They fall like rain from a clean sky. And yours," his gaze shifted sharply to the stepmother and her allies, "yours are venom, dripping from fangs that cannot hide themselves forever." The crowd gasped. No one had dared speak against the stepmother in public before. Her face twisted with rage, but before she could unleash her fury, another voice rose from the back. A merchant woman, balancing a basket of woven cloths on her hip, called out, "It is true. She has never wronged anyone here. She buys honestly, greets kindly, and has never brought shame. How can such a one be accused of theft?" The murmuring grew louder, no longer uneasy but awakening. A fisherman who had once received the girl's help when his nets tore added his voice. "When my catch failed, she shared her own meal with my children. Does that sound like the hands of a thief?" One by one, others found courage. A mother pulled her child close and said loudly, "My daughter looks up to her. I will not stand and watch her be destroyed by lies." Another merchant nodded firmly, lowering his wares as if to make his words carry greater weight. "I did not laugh because cruelty is not trade. We should not profit from another's pain." The stepmother's laughter cracked, no longer confident but shrill, desperate. She pointed at the girl again, her hands trembling. "You fools! You are blinded by her false tears. She deceives you all, just as she deceives me." But her words no longer struck as sharply as before. The shift had already begun. Heads turned away from her. Backs that once leaned forward in eager anticipation now straightened with dignity, refusing to entertain her cruelty. The air felt different, heavy with a rising sense of justice. The elder merchant spoke once more, his voice like the toll of a bell. "A village that mocks innocence invites its own curse. Today I will not mock. I will defend. Who stands with me?" And as though a dam had broken, hands lifted, voices called out, and the marketplace, once filled with ridicule, began to echo with defiance against the cruelty that had stained its heart. The girl, still trembling, raised her eyes slowly. For the first time she saw not laughter in their faces but solidarity. Something had shifted, something irreversible. The tide was turning. The air in the marketplace shifted like a sudden change in the wind. What had once been a crowd united in cruel laughter and jeers was now a gathering thick with silence, judgment, and unease. The words of the elder merchant still lingered. "Her tears are pure, yours are venom." His voice had carried weight, for he was not merely a trader of goods, but of wisdom, and people listened to him in matters that went beyond commerce. At first, the mockers tried to brush it off with louder insults. "Do not be fooled," her stepmother hissed, clutching at her shawl as if it were armor. "She is cursed. Her tears will drown us if we do not laugh them away." The relatives joined in, sneering and calling the young woman a witch who had bewitched the villagers with false kindness. But the crowd's laughter no longer rose to meet them. Instead, their words fell into the marketplace like stones sinking into a still pond. One by one, merchants turned their eyes away. A cloth seller folded his fabric slowly, refusing to meet the stepmother's glare. A spice trader who had once been quick to join mockery now turned his back entirely, busying himself with arranging jars of cumin and coriander. Even the children, once delighted by the cruel spectacle, shuffled closer to their mothers, no longer laughing. The stepmother felt the change, and her face paled as the air grew heavier with disapproval. The first true act of defiance came quietly. A woman who sold gourds and clay pots refused to haggle with one of the mocking relatives. "I have nothing to sell you," she said firmly, and turned away. The relative sputtered in disbelief. Later, another merchant echoed the act, refusing to sell dried fish to the stepmother. "Take your curses elsewhere," he muttered. Soon, it was not only sales that dried up, but greetings, nods, and the simple courtesies of the village. The mockers found themselves standing in the middle of a marketplace where every path led to closed faces and turned backs. No one stopped at their stalls, no one asked after their health, no one invited them to share food or shade. The laughter that once bound them together now rang hollow in their own ears. For the first time they felt the sting of being unseen, unwanted, and unwelcome. The young woman, who had been dragged here in humiliation, now stood quietly as the tide turned. She did not raise her voice, nor did she cast curses upon those who wronged her. She merely wept, her tears falling like rain upon the dusty ground. Those who had eyes to see began to understand. Her tears were not signs of weakness, but of a spirit too soft for cruelty, too gentle for spite. Days passed and the backlash deepened. The stepmother and her allies tried to sell their goods, but customers turned elsewhere. The villagers whispered to one another that buying from them would be like buying venom wrapped in cloth. Children were warned not to linger near them, lest the bitterness rub off. Even their closest companions began to distance themselves, fearing that association with the cruel would poison their own standing. At night, the mockers gathered in their homes, bitter and bewildered. "They will come back," one relative insisted. "They will need our goods, our labor." But the truth was harder. The marketplace had found balance without them, and the people no longer wished to trade cruelty for comfort. What once had been the laughter of the many was now the silence of their isolation. The young woman, meanwhile, was led away from the marketplace not in chains of mockery, but with cautious kindness. Women brought her water, children walked beside her without fear, and merchants whispered blessings for her endurance. The mockers were left behind, wrapped not in the applause of their cruelty but in the heavy shroud of exile. They had tried to strip her of dignity, but in the end, it was they who were stripped of belonging. They had called her weak, cursed, and broken, yet when the tide of hearts shifted, the girl was no longer seen as a figure of ridicule but as a soul of quiet strength. The same marketplace that once rang with cruel laughter now gathered in solemn reverence around her. The jeers were gone, replaced with hushed voices and gentle movements, as if the crowd itself sought forgiveness for what it had allowed. Two merchant women, who earlier had turned their faces away in shame, now stepped forward. One brought a clay jug of cool water, the other a bowl of millet porridge. Their hands trembled as they offered these simple gifts, and the girl, still sitting on the dusty ground, lifted her head with tear-streaked cheeks and received them without anger. She drank slowly, every sip washing away the sting of her public humiliation. She ate, though lightly, and in that act the crowd saw her endurance, not only of hunger or thirst but of cruelty itself. A group of children who had once copied the taunts of their elders crept closer. Instead of mocking, they now extended woven garlands of wildflowers, shyly placing them in her lap. The girl smiled faintly, and for the first time, her smile was not met with scorn but with warmth. Elders bowed their heads before her, acknowledging silently that her grace had revealed their folly. Even those who had said nothing before now sought to show, through action, that they stood with her. It was not a grand ceremony that marked her vindication, but the quiet, genuine gestures of a community that realized how far it had strayed. Traders who had once prized wealth above all else laid small offerings at her feet. Dried fruits, bolts of cloth, carved trinkets, tokens of respect more valuable than gold because they were born of contrition. Women who had spread whispers of envy now murmured prayers for her well-being, while men who had laughed the loudest lowered their eyes, unable to meet her gaze. The girl herself did not gloat, nor did she demand vengeance. Instead, she sat upright, her posture straight despite her weariness, her expression calm despite the storm she had endured. Her silence spoke louder than any curse or condemnation. She had suffered without malice and received kindness without arrogance, embodying a dignity few could match. By evening the marketplace looked transformed. Where once the mockers had commanded attention, now they stood apart, ignored and diminished, while the girl became the center of gentle care. A mat was laid for her beneath a tree, and she was invited to rest there, sheltered and safe. Food was shared, stories were told in softer tones, and her presence was honored as if she were more than just a girl. She was a symbol of what it meant to endure injustice with grace. That night, when the fires burned low, the villagers carried a new memory in their hearts. The day cruelty turned to shame and dignity rose from the dust. The girl, once humiliated, now stood vindicated, not by revenge but by the simple truth that her purity outshone their venom. The downfall of the cruel ones did not arrive with thunder or sudden catastrophe. It crept upon them quietly as shadows creep across the ground when the sun begins to set. The villagers who had once laughed with them encouraged their jests, or bought their wares began to look away. The mockers who had jeered at the girl found themselves standing alone in the market square, their voices loud but unanswered, their boasts hanging in the air like smoke with no fire to sustain it. At first, they dismissed the silence, telling themselves it was a passing mood. They shouted louder, exaggerated their cruelty, and tried to stir laughter as before, but no one joined in. The women at the well continued drawing water without turning their heads. The men at the stalls haggled with others but kept their backs firmly turned. Even the children, who once gathered to repeat their cruel words, now scattered at the sight of them. Trade was the first to die. No hands reached for their goods. Their fruits sat unsold, shriveling in the heat. Their fabrics faded on the racks as days passed without a single touch. Once, they had been known for their sharp tongues and cunning bargains, but now people sought out other merchants. Those who had shown mercy to the girl, those whose laughter had not been stained with venom. "Why do they pass us by?" one of the mockers whispered bitterly as a group of women crossed the market to buy from another's stall. His companion scowled, anger burning in his chest, but beneath the fury was a seed of fear. Greed, envy and cruelty, the very weapons they had wielded, turned inward. They began to distrust one another, suspecting betrayal in every glance. One accused the other of being the reason for their exile. Another snarled that it was not his words but the foolish pride of the others that had brought ruin. Soon their circle, once tight and united in mockery, split into fragments of suspicion and bitterness. At home, their children asked why no one came to visit anymore, why neighbors no longer shared salt, bread, or greetings at the doorway. Wives grew restless, ashamed to stand in the marketplace beside husbands who were now marked as cruel. Their houses, once full of noise and pride, grew heavy with silence. The collapse of their trade left them hungry. Where once they had thrown coins carelessly and boasted of their wealth, now they counted the little they had left with trembling fingers. The market refused them, and even when they tried to travel to nearby villages, word of their cruelty had already spread. No one wished to deal with those who mocked the tears of a girl and spat venom into the heart of their own people. And so, they were left in isolation. The jeers that once made them feel powerful became echoes that haunted them. They had mocked a girl's suffering to lift themselves higher, but now they were dragged into the pit of their own malice. Greed starved them, envy gnawed at their sleep, cruelty made them hateful to one another until even friendship became impossible. It was not the earth that swallowed them, nor a storm that swept them away, but the weight of their own wickedness that crushed them. By the time their downfall was complete, they were no longer feared, no longer envied, no longer even spoken of with anger. They became shadows at the edge of the marketplace, living reminders of how quickly cruelty can consume itself, leaving only ruin where pride once stood. The girl, once mocked for her tears, now stood as a living testament that resilience, dignity, and innocence were stronger than cruelty. After the downfall of those who had ridiculed her, life began to shift in ways she never imagined. Merchants who once sneered now came to her with respect. Villagers who once turned their heads away now greeted her with warmth. She prospered, not through greed or vengeance but through the quiet power of dignity. With the support of the community, she opened a small stall where she sold woven cloth, simple but beautiful, each piece carrying the mark of her patience and determination. Her work gained recognition quickly, not because of the cloth itself, but because people believed that anything touched by her hands carried the blessing of her innocence. Customers traveled from nearby villages just to buy from her, saying her spirit had purified the fabric. Her home, once a place of loneliness, became filled with laughter as neighbors visited to share meals, stories, and companionship. Children loved to sit around her, listening to her gentle words about kindness and courage. She never raised her voice, nor did she speak harshly of those who had wronged her. Instead, she said, "Let my life be the answer, not my bitterness." Those words spread far beyond her small corner of the village. Elders began repeating them in gatherings, merchants used them in their dealings, and travelers carried them to distant lands. Slowly, the story of the girl who endured cruelty with grace became a legend in itself. Meanwhile, the ones who had mocked her tears lived out the consequences of their actions. Stripped of their wealth, shunned by their neighbors and weakened by their own bitterness, they became shadows of their former selves. They had mocked innocence, but it was their cruelty that consumed them. Parents began teaching their children, "Do not laugh at the sorrow of others, for those who mock will one day be mocked by fate." The story turned into a warning, a moral guide carried down through generations. As years passed, the girl's legacy only grew. She prospered not just materially but spiritually. Her stall grew into a thriving trade, her cloth was sought after in many markets, and her home became a place of welcome for strangers. She never once boasted of her success, nor sought revenge on those who had hurt her. Instead, she continued living as she always had, humble, kind, and strong. The tale was retold around fires, in marketplaces, and during village festivals. Every retelling ended with the same moral: mocking the tears of the innocent brings the mocker's downfall. The story reminded people that cruelty may seem powerful in the moment, but it always carries its own seeds of destruction. Kindness, even when ridiculed, holds the strength to outlast mockery. The girl became a symbol not just of endurance, but of the truth that dignity will always rise above malice. And so, long after she was gone, her tears still lived in memory, not as a sign of weakness, but as the very force that turned an entire village toward compassion and justice.